Tom Theobald had a surprise last summer. He'd just written an article called "Do We Have a Pesticide Blowout?" for a trade magazine. In it, he criticized Bayer for conducting their study on honeybees on a relatively tiny plot of land. That same study concluded that on that small plot, systemic pesticides were safe for bees. Theobald wrote that it was, quote, a mockery of science. Shortly after his article was published, he got some interesting news.
I got a call from an EPA employee at headquarters who said, "Tom, you should be the first to know," and went on to explain that the scientists had gone back and reviewed that original study because of the request on the part of the chemical companies to expand its use, and had concluded that it was not a valid scientific study.
In a stunning reversal, the EPA did an about-face. They were now agreeing with the small beekeeper in Colorado, saying that the safety study from Bayer was deficient. This after the Bayer pesticide had been on the market for 8 years. A government source told us on background that the change was a routine reevaluation, but the beekeeping community was furious. Is this compound being used in cornfields today?
Yes.
It is?
Yes.
Where's the EPA? Why haven't they said, stop?
Well, a number of organizations signed a letter directed to EPA Administrator Lisa Jackson requesting just exactly that until the controversy over the science on this with pollinators can be resolved and good field studies that can be conducted, that as a precautionary move, the product be taken off the market.
That hasn't been done?
No.
That sense of exasperation extends beyond the beekeeping community and into the EPA itself. Sources within the agency we talked to said the handling of pesticide regulation has been the source of tension for years. Many scientists said their concerns have been ignored by the administrators handling the approval process. We asked the EPA for an interview. They declined. So we wanted to find someone who could help explain how the EPA decides which pesticides stay on the market.
I think we have a misconception.
Bill Coniglio spent his career as a scientist for the EPA and was one of the first to set up their Office of Toxic Substances, where he studied the impact of such materials as lead and pesticides on humans. He now owns a nursery in New Jersey and is an amateur beekeeper himself.
The general public basically says it is registered, therefore it must be safe. That is not true. There is a risk associated with exposure to the compound, and that risk may be minimal based upon the knowledge available at the time or the judgments made at the time, but it is not absolute safety.
The EPA is required by Congress to approve a pesticide based on what's called a risk-benefit analysis. Its decision considers the economic benefit to farmers, technological, political, and social factors. Science is only one of the factors Congress allows them to consider.
Scientists in EPA have always been frustrated with risk assessment, risk management. The inability to take and to address the risk has always been there. Whether we're talking about air programs, whether we're talking about drinking water programs, whether we're talking about pesticides or rugs or indoor air, it has always been that way.
Coniglio says that at the EPA, decisions are made by administrators, not the scientists who review the safety data. And both he and sources inside the EPA tell us that they themselves don't even know how management determines what pesticides are approved, and that the agency does not reveal enough about the process to the public. However, the EPA does make available on its website the analysis of its scientists, and documents we've uncovered suggest the scientists' warnings haven't been taken seriously, including the fact that systemic pesticides build up in the soil and can remain for many years. Also, Because the pesticides show up in pollen and nectar, they have potential for, quote, long-term toxicity and risk, quote, the eventual stability of the hive. And then there's this. Years before colony collapse disorder was identified, EPA scientists speculated about symptoms that sound similar to CCD. Will the exposed foragers become disoriented and fail to return to the colony? Nevertheless, the EPA says it doesn't have enough cause to limit use of these pesticides at this time. It's a much different story elsewhere. In Europe, for example, the European Union can and is keeping some systemic pesticides off the market for certain uses until it feels they are safe for bees.
It is argued that there is no proven scientific evidence of the causal link. And yet there are a number of scientific studies that have been carried out which suggest that there is a causal link.
A special conference was convened in March of this year that brought together European Union parliamentary members, scientists, and beekeepers to address the long-term effects of systemic pesticides on pollinators.
In 2008, major honey producers such as Argentina, Turkey, and some EU countries lost at least 1/3 of their colonies. There may be some debate about the cause of this loss of colonies, but you can't dispute the fact it's happening. And therefore, the need for urgent studies and urgent steps to be taken is very pressing.
That's just what several individual European governments have decided to do. France, Germany, and Italy have already restricted systemic pesticides for some uses after studies conducted in those countries showed links between pesticides and impacts on bee health. For now, the EPA has decided that a warning label on these pesticides is good enough. That label says simply, do not apply this product to blooming parts of plants if bees are present. Scientists say that does not work with systemic pesticides.
The systemic pesticides are different from past pesticides. That means an entire redesign of the methodology used by EPA in risk assessment and risk management. And that is their challenge.
There are some signs that the EPA is beginning to recognize the potential scope of the problem and is making some positive steps forward. This past January, the agency initiated a global conference trying to develop new approaches to determining potential risk of these pesticides to pollinators. The EPA says it stands by the overall safety of this class of pesticides and sent us this statement, quote, EPA is concerned about the decline of honeybees and other pollinators. This year, EPA scientists will begin an extensive reevaluation of the pesticide clothianidin and will include the public in its reevaluation. If regulatory action to protect pollinators is needed, we will implement any necessary restrictions, end quote. This isn't just about bees and farmland. These systemic pesticides can likely be found in a backyard near you. Look closely at the labels at your local garden store, and you will see the telltale chemicals used in a range of products. Scientists worry this is an ever-growing list, and they still don't know the long-term impact of these pesticides on honeybees.
Let's say that there is no risk. The data, when it's available, clears them all. That'd be a great thing. Be a wonderful thing. However, how can you take and make that judgment without the data, since you know that the compound is incorporated into nectar, since you have studies from universities showing that concentrations of exposure have adverse effects, how do you allow it to be used without the data that shows it's not a problem? You do that by taking and say, we judge the risk to be not as important as the benefits. And in that balance, that risk-benefit balance, it's obvious that they are not considering the collapse of the entire food chain. They're dealing with the benefits from a short-term perspective.
Our sources within the EPA have told us that the agency's public assurances about the safety of this class of pesticides mask what's really going on within the EPA. They said there has been a flurry of high-level meetings, and we were shown notes from one such meeting that suggest the agency has been urgently rethinking how it regulates these pesticides and admitting they don't have acceptable studies for bee safety.